If you're not aware, every episode of Zilog and Moto features two bits of music. There's the intro theme, which probably most of you recognize as coming from Streets of Rage. And if you don't, well, you should probably go study up on the legendary talent that is Yuzo Koshiro. But then there's the ending theme, which you would be forgiven for not knowing, as it's slightly more obscure, and let's face it, I'm sure that probably once the end credits hit, you're already off to the races and on to the next YouTube video and not paying attention to the music. However, that music is from a game that probably has my favorite non-Yuzo Koshiro Genesis soundtrack, which is known as Lightning Force in the United States and Thunder Force 4 everywhere else around the world. And yes, that is Lightning Force, not Lightning Force, and no, I'm not getting into all that now. We will save that for that review. Along with having a fantastic soundtrack, Lightning Force is one of my favorite shooters of all time just in general, as it has fantastic gameplay and graphics as well to go along with that soundtrack, and I highly recommend that anyone that hasn't played it to go ahead and give it a look if you like shooters even just a little bit. But what about Thunder Force 1, 2, and 3? How do they compare? Should you make an effort to go play them as well? Well, this is where things get a little embarrassing for me, but unfortunately I can't really answer that question because until working on this review for Thunder Force 2 this week, I hadn't actually played any of those games, just Lightning Force. However, I should probably pause for a second because I'm sure that there's some of you out there that don't know me and are now going to refuse to take anything I say seriously, because how could I possibly know anything about the Genesis and not have played Thunder Force 2 or Thunder Force 3 that was so impressive it ended up having the rarely seen port from a home console to the arcade? Well, hi, my name is Dave, and welcome to Zilog and Moto, the channel where I'd like to remind you, you probably shouldn't be taking a guy with a giant whoopee cushion that serious to begin with. Anyway, I'm out to collect and review the nearly 1,280 titles released in the English language for the Sega Master System, Genesis/Mega Drive, Sega or Mega CD as the case may be, and finally the 32X. Basically, if I can plug it into a Genesis either by itself or with some sort of add-on, and be able to read what's up on the screen, I'm trying to get a copy of it and review it for posterity, with both looks at that original packaging and gameplay captured from original hardware whenever possible. So, if I can defend myself for a bit, Thunder Force 3 is the game that's probably most odd that I haven't played. The original Thunder Force, which I'll go into in some more detail on in a little bit, was never released outside of Japan, and today's game, Thunder Force 2, is a very early Genesis game, being one of the 6 launch titles in the United States, and notably was the first third-party release for the Mega Drive in Japan. By the time I actually got a Genesis, Thunder Force 2 was long gone from the shelves at most retail shops and rental stores, and this was in the days before Electronics Boutique had come up with the idea to sell used video games, so it was just effectively gone unless you happened to see it at a yard sale or something. Even when it came time for Sega to release the Genesis Mini and Genesis Mini 2, Thunder Force 2 was nowhere to be seen, even though Thunder Force 3 and 4 were included in those libraries. So, what am I getting into with Thunder Force 2 this week? Is this a legendary shooter that lives up to the reputation of the other entries in the series that came later? Or is Thunder Force 2 simply an early effort for the console that had developer Technosoft clearly still needing to do some learning about the platform it was on? Well, we shall see, but first, a look at this old school package. And here's my copy of Thunder Force 2 for the Genesis. This copy is in decent shape, but it definitely is not mint, as not only does it have a little bit of wear in places, it is a former rental copy, which of course means you get all sorts of stickers and other things that I tried to clean up before shooting this. The outer cover looks pretty good, minus one ding near the top and the hang tab being removed, and the inner cover is decent with no edge wear or water damage, but it does appear to have some sun bleaching, fading going on, at least on the front. My guess is this copy was faced out at the rental store and sun would shine in on that particular shelf. Normally this is the part where I say that I'm good with this particular copy and it doesn't need to be replaced, but with this being a somewhat notable title in the catalog and a launch title, I might eventually try to buy a better copy, especially since you can usually find it for $40 or less right now. With it being a launch title, it's got the original Genesis cover formatting with art that takes up the entire front cover except for the beveled title section down at the bottom. I'm pretty sure I say this every time I review one of these, but this is my favorite style of Genesis cover formatting, bar none, and it's kind of amazing to me that they got this right the first time out, when at the same time the Master System covers were improving but still not great. And I know part of that is Tonka's fault, but still, it's clear Sega knew that they needed to change things up in the push for the new console. The art itself is great as well, showcasing your ship flying in for an attack run in the first level on the surface of the planet Nebula. And more so than any weird rental damage, having a non-faded version with that cover art is why I'd probably replace it eventually. In this era, the PAL releases had the same art usually as the North American versions, but Japan got different art, which is seen here. The Japanese cover is decent, and clearly Sega thought so too because they ended up using it on the cover of the North American manual. But if I'm honest, I prefer the North American cover, even though the ship on the Japanese cover better represents what your ship looks like in the game. One thing to point out though on the Japanese cover though, note that the title is listed as Thunder Force 2 MD, with the MD standing for Mega Drive. If you're American, this is probably a bit confusing, which is of course why that part was left out here. But this wasn't just a branding thing, this was to indicate that there was specifically the Mega Drive version of the game, which we'll talk about more in a bit. Flipping over the back, and there's that classic early Genesis formatting with one large screenshot at the top, followed by two smaller ones down below. And for 1989, they're all of very good quality, and serve to emphasize just how good this game looks for the time period. You were not getting graphics like this on the NES, that's for sure. The flavor text, on the other hand, well, if I'm honest, it's pretty typical for a game that originated in Japan for the time period, and it's just total nonsense that sounds ripped from some terrible anime. Just listen to this portion. You're Rider Jupiter, known as Ace to the Federation. You've got vengeance on your mind, and the only person you trust in battle is the faithful Diana Reen, a bold, determined comrade. It goes on, but you get the idea. I'd be a little bit more sympathetic to the world building that they're trying to do here, but none of this is referenced anywhere in the game itself. Opening up the package, and the manual is held up well, but you can see the number 8 written on it twice, which originally went with stickers both on the inner front cover artwork on the spine and directly on the cartridge label. The cartridge actually had 3 stickers on it originally, for reasons that remain unclear. As far as the manual goes, it's got that early Sega formatting, which I love, but you can also tell that it was early, because if you notice, they start to talk about the weapons here, stop to go over the different levels in the game, and then start over talking about the weapons at the end. I'm not sure if the graphic designers were just rushed due to this being a launch title or what, but I don't think I've seen a goof quite like that in any of the manuals discussed so far on the channel. Okay, that's the package. Let's fire up Thunder Force 2 and see how it's definitely a unique title in the Genesis catalog. Just real quick, before I start the actual Thunder Force 2 review, I wanted to discuss a bit about the original Thunder Force, because I think it's a bit of a question mark for a lot of people, and I honestly don't know when I would get to talk about some of this stuff ever again. A lot of the time, when there was a game in the early Genesis catalog that's a sequel, the assumption is that the prior game is on the Master System. For instance, Shinobi was a Master System game. Phantasy Star was a Master System game. Space Harrier was a Master System game. Thunderblade was a Master System game. You get the idea. So, where's the original Thunder Force, since it is not on the Master System? Well, instead of being on the Master System, it's on a platform that's actually very similar to the Master System, the Sharp X1. There's a good chance that you're not familiar with the X1 as it wasn't sold outside of Japan, but it was an 8-bit home computer that at least had a passing resemblance to the Master System from a hardware perspective, in that they both utilized Zilog Z80 processors as CPUs and had PSG sound chips. Thunder Force would be ported to a few other similar Japanese home computers, but it never saw a console release. In that same manner, Thunder Force 2 originally began as a Japanese home computer release, but this time Technosoft had moved up to the 16-bit era, releasing Thunder Force 2 for the Sharp X68000, which, you guessed it, now utilized the same Motorola 68000 CPU as the Genesis, just clocked slightly faster at 10 MHz. This is why the Japanese Mega Drive version of the game was marked Thunder Force 2 MD to differentiate between that version of the game from the original X68000 version. And just for full disclosure, while both versions of the game are pretty similar, the X68000 version is technically superior in a few ways. So if you come out of this review interested in Thunder Force 2 or were already a fan of the Genesis game, I'd definitely recommend giving that X68000 version a look as well. Even though you might not be familiar with the original game, Thunder Force 2 was specifically designed as a follow-up to that game, as was somewhat alluded to on the back of the box and also spelled out in the intro section of the manual. But essentially, Thunder Force 2 takes place 18 years after the original game, with Planet Nebula again being attacked by the forces of the Lone Star system. Why? Who knows, but apparently Emperor Rusiful just likes being a pain in the ass. I'm not taking points off for this, but just in case you're curious, one of the ways in which the X68000 version is better technically is that this story is also told via cutscenes in that version of the game, which I guess the Genesis version just might not have had room for, keeping in mind that with this being a launch title, the cartridges were limited to only 4 megabits. But that's just from a story perspective. Thunder Force 2 is also linked back to the first game of the series by its gameplay. If you're only familiar with Thunder Force 3 or Lightning Force, you might be surprised by this, but not only is Thunder Force 2 a side-scrolling shooter, it's also a top-down shooter. And I want to be clear about that because I've seen other people on the internet loosely describe Thunder Force 2 as having both vertical and horizontal shooting segments, and that's just not accurate, because those top-down levels aren't specifically vertical, as the top-down levels are actually presented as a rectangular repeating map with some slight maze tendencies. And not only can you move up, down, left, and right, but you can also move and fire at a diagonal. So lazily labeling it as a vertical shooter is simply wrong, and sounds something like that they might have come from someone that never actually played the game and only looked at screenshots. Okay, now that that mini rant is over, you might be wondering how that actually works. And it's a good question, but in reality, it's actually deceptively simple. The game consists of 9 levels, with all of the odd number levels being the top-down levels, and the even-numbered levels being the side-scrolling sections. The manual tries to tie the levels together 2 at a time, and I suppose there's some thematic similarities between, say, levels 1 and 2, or levels 3 and 4, but honestly, the levels really don't have anything to do with each other. And the way the continue system works, they're all considered separate. So that's good enough for me. And also, I'm very thankful that's the case, because having to replay through the top-down levels to get back to the side-scrolling levels would be pretty annoying and just lead to flashbacks from F-117 Nightstorm last week. And if anything, Thunder Force 2 shows how much better this system is. But that only answered part of the question, as far as the basic level structure goes. In traditional side or vertical scrolling levels, you know how it goes. You start at the beginning of the level, and then the game brings you through the level on rails until you get to the boss at the end. But what about these top-down levels, since you can choose where to go? Well, for these levels, the goal in each one is to destroy 4 bases in the level. Each base is usually defended with an assortment of other turrets and weaponry, so most of the time you'll need to be careful about how you attack, and probably use some strategy of picking off things from the outside and working your way in. And honestly, that's the easy part. What can be tough, at least until you've played these levels numerous times, is actually finding where the bases are in the level. The exception to this is level 5, which is pretty linear and takes place in a cave system, so there's one specific way through, but the rest of the levels can be a little frustrating until you've memorized the layout of where the bases are, at which point they become a lot easier. Still not easy, mind you, but at least you won't be wasting lives and continues while doing your Duke Nukem "Where is it?" impression over and over. I feel like I've read criticism of this game over the years, especially as compared to Thunder Force 3 and Lightning Force. It's usually been related to the top-down portion, as I think most people that played it only wanted a side-scroller. And that's fine, and at first I kind of agreed, especially the first few times playing through the levels and not knowing where anything was. You end up having to search the levels somewhat thoroughly, but also carefully, as Technosoft included elements in these levels like walls, gates that have to be opened to access other sections of the levels, high-rise buildings, and destructible portions that have to be cleaned out or else you lose a life when you run into them. These hazards were pretty annoying in the beginning, as they're just one more thing that you have to worry about when you're trying to figure out where the next base is. But once I got used to knowing, hey, don't run into that, it became second nature. Then there's the actual side-scrolling levels, which are probably what most Thunder Force fans are expecting. And they live up to the series' reputation. While perhaps they aren't as impressive as what would come later, and graphically aren't quite as detailed as what's presented in the original X68000 version, considering that this was a launch title, they are excellent, with even small enemies being animated, and there's a separate background layer which gives the levels a much needed feeling of depth. Each level has a traditional mini-boss and boss, whose arrival is preceded by an alarm, and these enemies are impressively large, with no real performance issues arising. There is a brief pause as the game loads each level's final boss, just due to their size, but during the actual fights, there's no slowdown and only the most minimal flickering. In fact, the entire time that I played the game, the only time I noticed slowdown at all was when playing in hard difficulty, in sections with standard enemies that shoot more projectiles than in normal. And even then, the slowdown is just very brief. Helping you to make your way through both the top-down and horizontal levels is a wide assortment of power-ups that you can obtain, which are mostly unique to each style of level. By default, your ship has either a dual cannon front or single cannon front and back configuration, so even if you're starting fresh due to just dying, you have options on how to attack. But like most shooters, you'll want to grab power-ups whenever you can, as it will make your progression through the levels easier. Certain weapons are definitely better depending on the situation that you're in, with an extreme example being the Hunter weapon, a heat-sinking shot that is great against general enemies, but can't attack ground targets in top-down levels or clear out walls in side-scrolling levels. So you may need to get good at switching between weapons on the fly, which thankfully is as easy as just tapping the A or C button. I really like all the different weapons, and the extra bit of strategy that having them adds to the game, with these side-scrolling levels often giving you a particular weapon that would be helpful for a certain section, which then makes getting that weapon, and not dying right away, all the more important. When you're not switching between weapons, B is your fire button, and thankfully, not only did Technosoft include a rapid fire option, they made it the default. I'm honestly not sure why anyone would ever turn rapid fire off, but I guess masochists exist, so if you really just want to make this game unnecessarily difficult, well, there you go. Speaking of difficulty levels, the game has 3 of them: training, normal, and hard. Most of the time that I spent playing the game for the review this week, I played in normal, which seemed like a solid difficulty level. And by the end of the week, I was able to make it to the second to last level, level 8, with no issues. Just for comparison's sake, I kicked the difficulty up to hard, and surprisingly, at least to me, I was still able to make it to level 7 with no problems, and I would have been able to make it to level 8 in hard as well, but I didn't quite have the layout for all of the 4 bases memorized in 7 yet. Honestly, while hard certainly throws more stuff at you on the screen, it's really not that much more difficult, and the bosses still take the same amount of damage to take down. I did find it interesting though that depending on which difficulty level you're playing in, the color of the background bar at the top of the screen and the game start screen would change. So if you're ever comparing high scores with someone, you would immediately know which difficulty level they're playing in. I can't say that I've ever seen another video game do that, and while it's a very minor feature, anytime I see something that I haven't seen before in a video game, it sticks out. The Thunder Force series is known for having great graphics, and Thunder Force 2 is no exception. I alluded earlier to the fact that the X68000 version is a bit more technically impressive, with the side-scrolling levels looking better in that version, but it's not better in all aspects. The top-down levels actually look better on the Genesis, so I'm a little surprised that the side-scrolling levels aren't as good as the original. My guess is that at the time, Technosoft probably struggled with performance and decided to feature simpler backgrounds so as to not cause slowdown in those levels, and I think that was the right choice. And I know that might sound like I'm being critical of Thunder Force 2 there, but even though the graphics aren't quite as good as the original X68000, it is still a great looking game, especially compared to everything else that was on the market at the time. I mentioned the solid performance, but there's also great use of color and detail in all the levels as well, with each of the 9 levels having a different look and a wide assortment of enemies with different designs. There's no palette swapping going on here. The music and sound in-game is not as impressive as the graphics, and definitely not as good as what would come later from a soundtrack perspective, but it's still very solid. I think one of the main problems I had was the way that they mixed the background music with the sound effects, in that the sound effects were too loud. This is a problem that is pretty common in shooters, but when you have a near constant shot sound effect playing, if it's too loud, it's going to drown out the background music, so it ultimately doesn't even matter how good the background music is, because all you hear is the sound effect, unless you just stop shooting for a bit. The music itself is quite good, and other than the mixing issues, the sound effects are totally appropriate for the game, with probably the only thing I'd mention as needing improvement being the quality of the digital speech. At the beginning of every game, you're greeted with some digital speech that sounds something like something good luck. And even though I heard that good luck sound effect probably 50 times this last week, I was never able to make out what was said before good luck. My only guess is that it's something in Japanese, but if you out there know what's being said, let me know down in the comments below. Thunder Force 2 is a game that I've wanted to review for a long time, and I'm really glad that I finally got around to it this week. Even though at first the top-down sections threw me for a bit, once I figured out that I just needed to memorize the levels and where everything was, I started to really enjoy myself. And the side-scrolling levels, while certainly not having quite the special effect pop of something like a Wings of War, they still held their own, and the whole game features some very fun and engaging shooting action with a wide array of weaponry and buttery smooth controls. I think the thing that's the most impressive to me about the game is just how early it was on the console. I've already mentioned that it was one of the 6 launch titles in the United States, but it was also only the 10th title released for the console worldwide, so that's about as first generation a game as you can get. When you take that into consideration, along with the overall quality of the game, I feel confident in giving Thunder Force 2 4 stars. Are the other Thunder Force games on the console better? Sure, but I dare you to find a better console shooter from the summer of 1989 than Thunder Force 2.
And that's it for Thunder Force 2. Now, in the comments leading up to this review, I know numerous people commented that this game wasn't as good as the later releases, and I get it, but if you haven't played it in a while, I definitely recommend picking it up again. And remember, think about what those other 5 launch titles were. I mean, you had Space Harrier 2, Super Thunder Force, Last Battle, Tommy Lasorda Baseball, and Ultra Beast. As much as I like Tommy Lasorda Baseball, Thunder Force 2 is head and shoulders above any of those titles, and it's not close, which makes me a bit disappointed that it's kind of been forgotten about over the years in favor of Thunder Force 3 and Lightning Force. Now, next time on the channel, there's no review video. This is one of those weeks where real life is getting in the way. Instead, I'm going to do something a bit different and talk a little bit about the state of the collection and maybe some plans for the future. But don't worry, as soon as I get back into town, I'll be hard at work on episode 288 as I get back into the swing of things next week. So enjoy that collection video, and maybe next week, and I don't normally say stuff like this, if you like the channel, spread the word. Maybe post a link to one of the reviews in a forum or on social media, whatever you think is appropriate. I mean, I'll still be here posting more videos regardless. Don't worry about that. But it couldn't hurt to get some more support for the channel as well, especially next week when the algorithm is probably going to be mad at me for not posting a review. Anyway, that's it for Zilog and Moto episode 287. If you liked what you saw here and want to see more,
please think about liking and subscribing if you're so inclined, as it will help more people see these videos. But most importantly, whatever you like to play, have fun and be excellent to each other. Later!